Hi everyone, welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host Leon Simons and I'm here with Vincent Gauci. Let me get some slides in here. I just wanted to give you a quick fresh up before I introduce Vincent and using this slide, using a few slides here. We all know about greenhouse gases, and of course greenhouse gases cause warming, and last decade, the warming from greenhouse gases is estimated to be about 1.5 degrees. Of course, we didn't see 1.5 degrees of warming yet because there was cooling as well. Certain particles were reducing warming, especially sulfur particles. And here on the right, you see a map where you see global sulfur emissions. Of course, you see sulfur emissions over the oceans. I've talked a lot about that over the past years, but you also see a lot of sulfur being emitted over India, over China, also over Europe, especially where in densely populated regions you see where people are burning fossil fuels, you see that there's a lot of sulfur being emitted. And that reduces the warming. But that's not often talked about. Often you hear about the warming effect of CO2, of course, and it's thought that the warming the warming effect from reducing sulfur pollution is more or less compensated by the cooling effect when you reduce methane concentrations or methane emissions, because both methane emissions cause about half degree of warming, and sulfur emissions cause about half degree of cooling. So that's nice and easy math. It just evens each other out, and then you get to a zero. And here you see the methane concentration, because that's what we'll mainly be talking about, methane today. You see the methane concentrations in the atmosphere based on ice core data of the past 800,000 years to today. You see it really off the chart. It's now in 2023, it's about 1943 parts per billion. Okay, and now I want to introduce you to Vincent. Hi, Vincent. Welcome to Climate Chat.
Hi, Leon.
Hi.
It's nice to be here.
Yes, great to have you. So you're doing research on wetlands, right?
That's right. Well,
can you please introduce yourselves and then we get to what you do?
Sure. So I'm Vincent Gauci. I'm a Professorial Fellow at the University of Birmingham, where I'm also part of the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research and the Birmingham Institute of Sustainability and Climate Action. So I have a range of interests, and I see we have this slide up here now. So, it talks a little bit about some of my background. I studied in an Earth Sciences department at the Open University, where I did my PhD, but I was also based at that time at the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology up in Scotland. And that was principally to be closer to the peatlands, the wetlands that I was interested in examining. As part of that, I've never been satisfied with looking just at processes in the field, although, I'm an ecosystem scientist and biogeochemist. As part of that, I spent a little bit of time in the US at NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies back in 1999. So we're going way back here. And that was really to try and understand some of these processes that we're going to talk about, but at the large scale. So that's kind of my training and background. And then I went up through the ranks at the university, and now I'm a professorial fellow at the University of Birmingham.
Thank you. And I think there's a very interesting thing I read on your website that people can read about, find your website, link to your website and more details about your work on the description of this of YouTube. And one thing I read is that there's a microbe named after you. Can you talk a bit about that? And maybe you can pronounce the name, because it looks quite.
That was a really nice surprise. It was from a group I didn't know in Austria, working out of Vienna, and they were a group of microbiologists, and they'd been working on isolating these sulfate reducing bacteria in peatlands. And This was about, well, I think about 7 or 8 years ago now. But it was in recognition for some of the early work that I did that I've just been talking about, relating to sulfur impacts on methane emissions from peatlands. So it was I'd had no contact with this group, and it was just really nice to be honoured by them with this this single cell organism.
Sorry, what was the name of that organism? Sorry.
You know what? I can barely remember it. So it was very nice to see it on the screen earlier. Sulfur telmatamonas gauchii, I think.
Well,
there we go.
Sulfur. Yeah, I think you pronounced it better than I ever can. Gauchii, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that was a nice bit of recognition for the work, sort of many years on. But yeah, it was work associated with my PhD essentially that I got that recognition for it. Yeah.
Interesting. Great, thank you. Congratulations on that. I think it's a really nice achievement to have something permanent in your name in a way, right? So can you? I think let's start with talking about what wetlands are, because we will be talking about methane emissions from wetlands, but maybe you can talk a bit about wetlands. When I think about wetlands, I think about the forest next to my house, which is on peat, or I think about the jungles I visited in Latin America, but I also think about rice paddies, right? So yeah. Is that what wetlands are, or?
Yeah, so I mean, wetlands are essentially wet ecosystems, as the name suggests, but there are many different types. If we're talking about the natural wetlands on Earth, then yes, you're absolutely right. You've got the peatlands. You also have seasonal wetlands, and you have very shallow ponded areas. But they vary hugely. So even within a type, and we have swamps as well, which are more like forested wetlands. So these are hugely diverse ecosystems. They harbor a huge variety of life. I mean, if you ever get the chance, for example, to go somewhere like the Pantanal in South America, especially when there's high water, then you see an abundance of wildlife in these sorts of locations. So principally, they're known for their wildlife, but they're also really important stores of carbon. So those peatlands that you mentioned that are local to you, they're huge stores of carbon. And in the high northern latitudes, they've essentially been accumulating carbon since the last glacial maximum and since the end of that period. So the last 12 or...
That's the permafrost, right?
Well, permafrost is something slightly different, but certainly permafrost can create the impermeable conditions that mean you don't get water dripping away or draining away, and that can create a wetland environment. But it's more the case of having a high supply of water, and the water doesn't escape readily. Okay, so that's where you start to get the succession. You get sphagnum forming, and over time that sort of develops and builds up, and you get things like sedges, etc. So those are the peatlands that we find in sort of relatively high northern latitudes, temperate as well, across the US and across Eurasia as well. And then you move south and you can get a different makeup. You still get the peatlands, but if you're looking at the peatlands of Central America, or principally the peatlands that you find in Southeast Asia, then it's a completely different system. I mean, you will find, and also because they're in the tropics, they won't have been affected by glaciation. You find peat that is tens of meters thick, that dates back sort of pre-last glacial maximum into the previous ice age. So that's an abundance of carbon that you have locked in there, principally because you have high water levels, which groundwater levels almost at the surface, if not at the surface, and that prevents oxygen from getting down to the peat, allowing decomposition to take place. And that's why you get really good preservation. Things like bog bodies that are occasionally dug up in places like Germany or in Ireland, or what have you, where there's peat. That's preservation is principally because there's no oxygen down in those environments. Now, the flip side of that is that you get, in anaerobic conditions, you get methane being produced. So the microbes that produce methane can only
maybe explain, because I know what anaerobic means, but maybe you can explain it for those.
Yes. Yeah, so actually oxygen is toxic to methane producers in these environments. So they can only survive without oxygen. And anaerobic just basically means there's no oxygen available.
And those are bacteria.
Yes, well, technically they're known as archaea, but yes, they're microorganisms that many people would consider to be bacteria. But yeah, they're actually a completely different set of organisms. But so those microbes occupy the very bottom of what we call like the redox ladder. Okay, so once you have fermentation taking place, and then the expenditure of various other nutrients that you might find in a wetland environment, and those nutrients generally, especially in something like a peatland, are only supplied by rain. So there's not, these are very nutrient poor systems. You can get some that are more nutrient rich, but in these nutrient poor systems, once all that ladder of what we call, okay, this is a very technical term, what we call alternate electron acceptors, once that gets extinguished and used up, the very last step of carbon degradation is the production of methane. So, and then that gets produced, and then that gets emitted out to the atmosphere via either diffusion, or it gets entrained in some of the roots from some of the larger herbaceous plants. And indeed, in some things like in wetlands, in floodplains, like the Amazonian seasonal floodplains, there you get that methane entrained in the roots of trees and emitted out of the tree stems. And I think we'll be talking a bit more about that later on.
Just to give an idea, I visited in Bolivia. I visited the Amazon. I was back in 2009, and I had never really realized that you have this. I always thought that there was always a lot of rain in these rainforests, but there's also a dry period, and then the water level can be about 15 meters lower at certain places than at during the heavy rain period. Then the water levels increase by 15 meters, and then I can imagine that when all this the biomass deposits, then and it starts to rot, of course, and there's no oxygen available, then this methane is released, and then if the water goes down, of course, then
exactly. I mean, it's a remarkable ecosystem because the trees have to tolerate so much. They have to tolerate being inundated for 3 to 6 months of the year, up to 10 meters of flooding, and then conversely, they have to deal with drought. When the water table is so low. But you're absolutely right. And actually, the carbon that they use in those soils to produce the methane, generally, because it's so hot and there's so much biological activity, there's very little carbon in the soils. So in those types of systems, it's the photosynthate that was fixed by the leaves that leaks out of the roots that gets rapidly turned over into methane. So it's almost functioning like a bit of a bioreactor.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I think that's, as I understand it, that because of the increase in carbon dioxide, CO2 in the atmosphere, of course, there's more CO2 is plant food, right? As the climate deniers like to say. But that is, of course, true. Plants use, if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, there's more photosynthesis. But I think as you also write in your paper, that's also a methane feedback. Correct?
Yes. So if you're producing more productivity in the plant or in the tree, and if it's taking up more carbon, then, and if other things aren't limiting, so there may be other nutrients that could limit that additional absorption of CO2. But all those things were, if they're all operating together in a good way, for the tree or the plant to work better, then yes, you will get more productivity. And a consequence of that additional productivity is additional decomposition, because you're going to have a fraction of that additional productivity will go down into the roots where you're not going to have that oxygen. And so that will basically feed the methane producing microbes, and that will create more methane. There are some other feedbacks that aren't still properly understood relating to CO2 and to trees. And indeed, at my institute, the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research, we have one of these very large experiments where we're essentially fumigating an intact and mature oak forest in the high northern latitudes, well, in temperate latitudes, to experience the sort of CO2 we'd envisage for 2050. So, we need these large experiments to really see how these things play out. But you're absolutely right. If you increase productivity by increasing CO2 and other things aren't limiting, then you're going to be producing more methane.
And then you built is it like a biodome? I remember there was maybe 20 years ago, there was this movie where they built this like enormous, like greenhouse without interaction.
That's how the early experiments were done. And that was one of the easier things to do because you can control CO2 relatively well if you have an enclosed environment. The problem with those enclosures is that immediately once you enclose it, you're divorcing the ecosystem of interest from its natural experience, which would be to experience wind, rain at irregular intervals, etc. So what we have at Birmingham, and what is also being set up currently in the Amazon in Brazil, is what we call a FACE experiment, FACE, for free air CO2 enrichment. So there's no enclosure. These are large scale. So we have these rings that enclose trees, and those rings are about 30 meters wide, and they're replicated, and they go up to about 20 to 40 meters high, depending on the forest. And they actively monitor the wind direction so as to pump the CO2 in and raise the concentrations. And there's a constant monitoring and a constant feedback within the system, so you can control it within free air, so it can experience everything that's natural. So we're talking next generation type experiments that are really vital for understanding how our ecosystems are likely to operate into the future.
Wow. And that's, is that a large area or are there a few trees?
Yeah, so an individual, we call them rings. So an individual array of rings is about 30 meters wide. So, you have a large number of trees in that. And certainly in the Amazon, you have lots of trees because, they're quite thin pole type trees. But so you're actually monitoring something that is very, very close to being a natural system, as close as you can get it pretty much.
Okay, without, so you have the different 30-meter diameter plots.
That's right.
Yeah, and then you can compare these plots to other regions which don't experience the CO2 levels of 2050 yet.
Exactly. So what we have are these controls that we have all the same infrastructure, but they're just not, and they're blowing it out as well, but there's no CO2 in there. And then for a time, you also have these ghost plots that don't even have the infrastructure. So very, very well replicated experiments, but at scale, you can't actually have too much replication with the individual treatment.
Oh, interesting. Must be nice to see all that like real plants growing and see and measure what's happening in the real world.
Absolutely.
That can be used for models, and I think that's an important step towards the next question, because already back in let me see, in 2004 you published a paper which has a title, Sulfur Pollution Suppression of Wetland Methane Source in 20th and 21st Century. Maybe you can talk a bit about that, and then taking into account the question of whether this is taken into account in climate models, because what you're doing is real world observations, and then the question is, okay, what does that mean for the models?
Yeah. So I'll take it back to the beginning of how we actually came up with this understanding. So essentially, for my PhD, I did an experiment on a peatland where I simulated the sorts of deposition of sulfur that you would get in some of the more sulfur polluted areas of Central Europe or Northeast America. And the rationale behind this was that, we have these wetlands that are experiencing what, we called acid rain at the time. And that was a big issue in the 80s, certainly. When I came to the question, sulfur in the Northeast America and in Europe was on the decline, but it was also on the increase in places like the Far East with rapid industrialization. So the rationale behind this was that the sulfur that was being added to the peat through atmospheric deposition of pollution was stimulating one set of microbes. So these are sulfate reducing microbes. And if you remember earlier on, I was talking about this sort of redox ladder. Well, if you have these sulfate reducing bacteria, they're far more able to utilize carbon substrates. And it's energetically more preferable for them to use that and to metabolize that. And so essentially what happens is that with sulfur being available, they outcompete the methane producing microbes.
Is that even in low oxygen environments?
Yes, because they operate in low oxygen environments as well.
Okay, both.
And that's where they prefer to live. But it's not always as simple as that. So the other situation is that these microbes, these sulfate reducing bacteria, are actually, in the absence of sulfate, they're operating in a different way. So they're metabolizing these higher chain organic compounds. And as a consequence of that, they're producing hydrogen, which actually, if you produce too much hydrogen, it's toxic for the microbe itself. So one of the ideas is that they actually come into some kind of association with another set of microbes that use hydrogen. And so that would have been the methane producing microbes. So you had this association in the absence of sulfate. Now you introduce sulfate to that, the sulfate reducing bacteria sees that sulfate and thinks, I'm doing that instead. And so it uses that sulfate, then it's competing with the methane producing microbe. But not only is it outcompeting that microbe for substrates, it's also denying that microbe a supply of hydrogen that it was previously producing. So there's a number of different mechanisms, but ultimately you're limiting the capacity for the methanotrophs or the the methane producing microbes to produce methane. And so it's a microbial competition that's happening as a consequence of this. So
and the microbe, trying to simplify this a bit, does that mean that when there is sulfur present, the microbe that has your name is winning?
Essentially, yes. That's exactly what happens. And it wins out, and it not only does it win, it deprives the methane producing microbe of something it was previously giving to it to produce methane. So it's got a double whammy effect on the methane production. But so it doesn't shut it down completely, because the amounts of sulfate that are being added are relatively small. It's kind of small pulses. That sulfur, once it goes away, it sort of goes into reduced compounds, and there's some cycling that happens, which can extend the lifetime of those small pulses. But a lot of it goes into these forms that are not available. So it's kind of dependent on a constant supply of sulfur, which is what you would have under a pollution scenario. So my question at that point, so we found that there was this suppressive effect, and this is work I did with Nancy Dice, who was my PhD supervisor, and also David Fowler at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And I was never satisfied with just understanding the process, and this is something I've carried forward in a lot of my career. I wanted to see, well, what does this mean? So I was very fortunate to get what was called a planetary biology internship at NASA. And this was NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies, where, Jim Hansen was the director at the time. And Elaine Matthews was who I approached, who was there. And Elaine was one of the pioneers of understanding wetland distribution. So she had the very first wetland maps. And what was great about going to NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies over there was that not only did they have these wetland maps, but they had the sulfur in the aerosols spatially distributed, and they were interested primarily from an aerosol perspective. But that sulfur also had to rain out somewhere, so they had sulfur deposition fields for a range of years. So this was perfect. So we had the sulfur deposition, and then we had the wetland model. But then I also had to work with a young postdoc at the time called Bernadette Walter. She had one of the early methane models. So the methane model needed the map of wetlands, and then we also had the sulfur deposition on there. And because of the experiment I'd been doing in northern Scotland, but also experiments that others had been doing elsewhere in North America, in Canada, and also in Scandinavia, we were able to come up with this emergent pattern of suppression, of percentage suppression of methane versus the deposition rate. So the amount of kilograms per hectare per year that, you know, was being experienced, like a dose response curve essentially. And that enabled us to upscale and to find out how important this was. And so that was...
Was this the study in 2004 or?
Yeah, this was the study in 2004. So it was very much what the modeling community would say was an offline study. So it was, you know, we had output from one model, we had output from another model, and we somehow linked them together using a function. And we were able to do that for a number of years and come up with an estimate of how important this was at the global scale. And, you know, we understood that at that time that sulfur was keeping a lid on methane from the wetlands. It was essentially keeping it below what we considered to be pre-industrial levels of methane as modeled. So that was quite interesting. But what we were also like looking forward and looking at what would happen in the future. And at that time, this was in, you know, like I say, it was 2000, 2004 when this came out. You know, we didn't have as good an idea of what was going to happen into the future. So, but there was an expectation that would lift and that wetlands would increase again in their methane output. So at that point,
is that this number? I think is it? I think 26 teragrams. Okay. Can you see it?
Yeah. So
yeah, it's like 50% of the total wetland source.
That's right. So that was an estimate for 2030, so 5 years away from now. But, you know, at that point, it was out into the future. And, you know, the suggestion, and that was based on certain scenarios that we were using at the time. So those scenarios have now changed. But the idea was that there was going to be that much. I'm sorry?
I'm saying reality has changed from your scenario.
Exactly. And that's the trouble with scenarios, right? They don't. Once you get to reality, you understand which scenario is the correct one. But then
you can rerun.
Yes, you can do that. So this was all kind of nice, but I decided to move direction after that. You know, the sort of grant money that was going into pollution effects research in terms of sulfur was seeming to drop off. There was less interest because in North America and in the UK and in Europe, you know, it was a problem that was being solved, sulfur deposition.
Yeah, so the sulfur emissions were rapidly decreasing.
Exactly.
And I think now I have a nice graph for this as well, where you can see that I think this is the UK, which is the most clear. This United Kingdom, where you can see that the sulfur emissions, of course, during the Industrial Revolution, and the United Kingdom was the first to really industrialize at a large scale, started to really increase, and then now they are back down at levels even from before the 1800s because of this enormous decrease in air pollution, because of the clean air regulations, and of course the technology to reduce these emissions.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, it's interesting seeing that graph because you see the first half of that with the increase, a lot of that was locally deposited. It was damaging UK ecosystems. And then in the second half of that, after the dip in the 1950s, you know, with the understanding that this was causing problems, you have the taller chimneys, and then we get transboundary air pollution. So that's when, you know, the UK's pollution was affecting Scandinavia effectively. But yes, it's tremendous.
We just built higher chimneys in the start, right? That's the first way to address air pollution was to build higher chimneys.
Exactly, distribute it. diffuse it somehow. It just meant other nations were going to receive it, albeit in a slightly more diffuse way. But the figure you just showed there is just a testament to just how useful and how important environmental legislation and agreements across nations, because if we're talking transboundary air pollution, you have to have nations coming together. So that's a fantastic testimony to the fact that we can, really make some serious inroads into problems through cooperation. Yeah, I mean that's a great.
I think this is the global, or this is from the United States and China and India, and you can really see that the United States rapidly decreased emissions.
Yeah.
And I don't, and that is there another one here? I don't know. It's United Kingdom. So indeed, there's a lot of changes in, and here you can see the collapse of the Soviet Union.
That's right.
So there's a lot of things that you can learn from, or you can see when you look at these graphs. And and when these emission changes happen over or near wetlands, I think that's what your research shows, is that, from my understanding, is that you would expect changes in methane emissions.
That's right. So, like I mentioned earlier, that there's you're dependent on a constant supply of sulfur. So if that supply of sulfur dries up because of pollution legislation, then you're going to have some recycling, because some of that reduced form of sulfate is in a readily reoxidizable form, and that gives it sort of a long tail. So it's not an abrupt thing, but you will ultimately be depriving those sulfate reducing bacteria of sulfate, and then the competition between those microbes starts to favor the methanogens again. And then, you might get the sulfate reducers performing their old function again of supplying hydrogen to the methanogens, etc. So that's what's happening. It's kind of the lid that you had placed on that wetland is essentially becoming lifted. And we did examine that in the field. So we went back after that experiment for a number of years, and we did find that there was some recycling, and it continued, but then it started to drop off as well. So we knew that there was going to be this recovery effect. But then the question then is, well, is the recovery going to be real? What are the effects for global methane if that were to take place? And that's what we examined in this recent paper by Lu Shen and colleagues and myself, where we took that work forward in a more because computer models had changed and climate models had changed. We were able to examine these biogeochemical feedbacks in some greater detail. So when I say these biogeochemical feedbacks, I mean the effect of sulfate being lifted, but also the effect of CO2 as acting as a sort of fertilizer for plants to increase their carbon output, which would feed methane producing microbes in these wetlands. So you have these twin effects that are sort of, one's a decline and one's an increase. So there's a decline in sulfate and one's an increase, which is the CO2, but they both sort of combine to produce additional methane. And that's what we examined in this paper, using sort of far more sophisticated techniques than I did back in 2004. And that was really nice to see. So we were able to really disaggregate the meteorological effect. So, the warming effect that you find, which, if you have a wetland and you warm it up, it's the microbes in there are going to produce more methane. They're going to do more of what they do because the energy is there. So you're going to have that element. You're going to have the sulfate lifting, element, and then you're going to include also the CO2 enrichment effect. And combining all those, we're able to disaggregate those for the future. And we did it all the way up to 2100.
And maybe now, should I think that's, you want to explain what this means?
Yeah.
Because I think this is these are your results.
Yes, so right? These are for a couple of different climate scenarios, because again, we're looking at scenarios because we're looking into the future. And you know, these are what we call SSPs, or shared socioeconomic pathways, and these are the ones you'd expect for like 1.5 to 2 degrees. And you know, with the 2 degree one, if you look at, so let's look at A, the one at the top. Very simply, you see the net effect in terms of methane emission, and that's in teragrams per year of emission from wetlands. A teragram being 1 million tons,
which is the same as
exactly that's 1 million tons.
Yep,
so you know, if you look at the blue bar, for example, that's through just direct warming, and clearly from the 1.5 degree one to the 2 degree scenario, you're going to see a jump at the 2 degree one, which is an easy way of seeing how warming can influence the system. Then on top of that, we have the sulfur effect, which actually at 1.5 degrees is bigger than it is at 2 degrees scenario. So, well, I mean, actually, it's broadly forgive me, it's broadly the same. But what is different is the CO2 effect, because at 1.5 degrees, there's less CO2 going in the atmosphere in that scenario than there is at the 2 degree scenario. So these are all combined to come up with a number of million tons. So you see for the SSP 119, which is the 1.5 degree scenario, you get an additional 20 million tons per year from wetlands as a consequence of combined warming, lifting of the sulfur burden, and additional CO2 effects, which are actually quite small at that point because you have less CO2 in that scenario. Then you look at the 2 degree scenario, you have that additional warming effect, which we've discussed already, and then you have a similar sulfur deposition effect, and then you have the additional CO2 effect, which is a bit more important. And there we're up to like 32 million tons. So, you know, a good 50% more at least than in that previous scenario. Now, you know, what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of how we should plan for the future? So right now, I don't know if you want me to discuss the global methane pledge, Leon, or...
Yes, I think that's and also in relation to the question I asked already, is, has this been included? Because in the climate models already, in the climate models, do these climate models take into account the effect of these special microbes which bear your name that interact with sulfur and produce and cause a reduction?
Yeah, so for a lot of them have a land surface component. Most of them will have that. Most of them will have wetlands, and most of them will treat methane in response to climate. So those blue bars you would see within the climate models. What's different here is that we're adding these biogeochemical feedbacks, the sulfur deposition effect and liberation, and the CO2 enrichment effect, just to see how specifically in terms of methane, rather than, you know, looking at net climate effects, what that means. And, you know, methane is important, as we've established, for climate, but it's also important for human health. It's a precursor for tropospheric ozone, which has effects for, you know, respiratory illness, and it's also what we call phytotoxic. So plants don't like ozone, and their crop yields aren't going to be as good if you have that there. So there's all round a very I'm sorry,
and that's also part of that's also an important part, the ozone, which is often many people don't realize that, but the ozone is also a forcing, a greenhouse gas forcing in the troposphere. Yeah. Many people, when they think about ozone, they think about the stratosphere, where the ozone absorbs UV radiation. But in the troposphere, it's about 0.5 watt per square meter, where it almost doubles the effect of methane, if I understand it correctly.
No, that's right. It's you know, if you're looking at the overall effect of methane. And in some of the earlier bars from previous IPCC results, you see this disaggregated. You see the direct methane effect, and then you see these additional effects as well on top of that. So yeah, I mean, it's vitally. There we go. You see it there. Well, I mean, even that hasn't been properly. Yes, so you've got those two bars where it's disaggregated. So you know, this is kind of important. And you know, the thing with methane also, which I haven't properly addressed in this podcast, is that it's a quick win. It's a quick climate win. I mean, you know, a molecule for molecule, one molecule of methane is, depending on the time horizon you're looking at, so over 100 years, that molecule of methane will have approximately 30 times the global warming power of CO2. If you look at it over a 20-year, more contracted 20-year time horizon, you're looking at around 80 times more powerful. And there's different ways of calculating this. Some even suggest it's even higher. So, but the other aspect of methane is its short lifetime. So it only lasts in the atmosphere around 9 years, just under 10 years. So it means that it's extraordinarily sensitive to sources and sinks. Anything you do to a source, like warm it up and create more methane, is going to be manifested relatively quickly in atmospheric methane concentrations. Conversely, anything you do to reduce methane will give you a quick result in the atmosphere. So, you know, this has been recognized by the global so here's the global methane budget. And you can see all the different contributors. Right now, I think it's something like 60% of all emissions are coming from anthropogenic sources. But here you can see, and those anthropogenic sources are things like fossil fuel production use, leaks from fossil fuel, from fracking, etc. Then you have agriculture and waste. So you mentioned earlier rice agriculture is a relatively small component, but you know, a lot of what comes out from agriculture is through ruminants, things like cattle, sheep. They all burp out methane. That's a big source. And also the waste they produces a lot of methane as well. And then you get these other things. So, you know, you have this intermediate arrow, biomass and biofuel burning, because it's, you know, what of burning is anthropogenic and what is natural. That's very difficult to disentangle. And then you have the natural wetlands, which are a big source. But then also, if you look on the other side there, you have the sinks. So you have you know, chemical reactions in the atmosphere, and that would be OH, nature's atmospheric detergent, hydroxyl ions in the atmosphere that clean up most things. And then you have this. I'm sorry? Yeah, and then you have this sink in soils. So, and we'll talk a bit later.
Hydroxyl OH is the main thing.
That's right. It's huge. It's the big one, and it's hard to characterize. And yet there are a lot of atmospheric chemists who are working on these problems because there is change associated with that. And there's also opportunities to modify that somewhat. Okay, so there's people looking at that. Me as a terrestrial ecologist and biogeochemist, I'm principally interested in what's happening at the sinks or the surface.
And what I think is interesting here, because the orange ones are anthropogenic fluxes, and the blue ones are natural fluxes. And in a way, green bars here should maybe also be more orange, because it also influences.
Well, there's that, and you know, some people have proposed a sort of a new kind of terminology and referring to wetlands as being functionally anthropogenic because they are responding to anthropogenic drivers. But then you could also argue that all ecosystems are functionally anthropogenic because they're experiencing elevated CO2. And my one concern with going that route is that it leaves open the suggestion that, well, hey, if they're anthropogenic anyway, or functionally anthropogenic, then we can intervene. And my argument is that, well, you know, yes, they could be functionally anthropogenic, but if you look back at the other half of that global methane budget, you've got all the unnatural sources. And that's where we should be focusing our attention. That said, we could also look at how to address emissions from other sources and indeed seek to draw out methane from the atmosphere using so-called atmospheric methane removal technologies that are only just recently being proposed. So the Global Methane Pledge, which was signed into action at COP26 in Glasgow a few years ago now, that had the specific aim of targeting anthropogenic methane emissions. It wanted to reduce methane on 2020 values by 30% by 2030. And if that were to be achieved, the climate dividend that you'd get from that would be about 1/3 of a degree. Okay, by 2050, that's actually substantial. That's important. So, absolutely, we can look at these other exotic approaches, but tackling anthropogenic emissions is key. It's really important that we reduce those. And in many respects, they're low-hanging fruit, and there are technologies to intervene and to abate those emissions. And we have the Global Methane Pledge where people are actively looking at this. So that's all really important.
And is this because an important source of this methane is cattle, is cows, and are those the similar bacteria, or sorry, you said they're not
microbes?
Are they the same? Are they the same type or species of microbes emitting this methane? And is it possible to, for example, feed methane emitting animals more, for example, sulfur foods like onions or garlic to reduce these sulfur emissions?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So, from one angle, from the point of view of production of milk, for example, people were trying to increase the amount of metabolized food that went into milk production, and they saw methane production as an expense, as a loss of that potentially usable carbon that could have turned into milk.
Exactly. Yeah, because it's energy. They are obtaining
exactly
energy.
That. So there have been people looking at things like you say, like garlic as a supplement. Daffodils I've heard as well. Also things like seaweed, which also has sulfur compounds. I mean, you have to be careful with sulfur because it can actually create a condition in the cow or in the rumen of the sheep, which can actually be not great for the animal itself. But there are additives that people are using. They're using them now. There's a lot of controversy about that as well, about these additives that reduce the methane from these cattle. So that's an intervention that you can have to reduce emissions. The other intervention you could do is personal choice. You could eat less beef. You could eat less milk. Those kinds of things. Yeah. But it's the nature of a kind of modernity and large populations that there are always downstream consequences, whatever you do, if you're shifting from one thing to another. So, these things are going to be debated, and that's not what we're here to do. But
no, but I think it's quite interesting. I remember, I think maybe 15 years ago, when I was at a conference, there was this device which was measuring the methane in the atmosphere of the room, and then he said, exhale into the device, and I exhaled, and then it showed a spike in the methane concentration, which showed that I was exhaling methane, and then he explained that I think 1/3 of the people also exhale methane, and it also depends on their microbiome and indeed on the food they eat. So it's and yeah, I think I thought it was quite interesting to learn that there's many things like changing also how you digest your food, but also how that influence the regional climate, but also the global climate.
Absolutely. And there's been a lot of work also with things like rice agriculture as well. So we have to try and reduce these anthropogenic emissions. But what the work that we published recently in Science Advances has shown that the lifting of the sulfate lid and the additional methane that's being produced also from the additional CO2 means that, that the safe operating space, if I can use that phrase, maybe the operating space within which the global methane pledge has to operate in, has to work that much harder, because 8 to 15% of what's allowable within that is no longer available. So if you want to get the same effect as you'd originally envisaged from the global methane pledge, you're actually going to have to work much harder in reducing those anthropogenic emissions. And also, you can start to consider these other technologies, but also these technologies relating to atmospheric methane removal, of which, a more recent discovery we found could actually have a beneficial effect, and that's simply by planting more trees.
And I think that's really crucial, because now we're getting to the solution. So one thing we can do, of course, is, as I understand, stronger pledges, right? Because the pledges that were pledged were in a way not strong enough, let alone that whether we are, of course, fulfilling the pledges. But then let me see, because there's another paper which you published last year. Let me show it as well, because then you talk about trees. Because first you were talking about how trees in the tropics were putting the sulfur into the ground, and there was sulfur being emitted. It was methane being. The trees were putting carbohydrates into the soil, and there was methane being emitted. But now you're saying other trees can also act as a carbon or as a methane sink.
So this is a relatively, it's a very new discovery. We reported this in Nature back in July last year. And you're absolutely right. So, in a wet environment, in a floodplain environment, or in a peat swamp forest, for example, the trees act as a pathway of emission. But you have to remember that the wetland trees are a relatively small area. The vast majority of trees exist in what we call upland forests. Okay, that as a distinction to a wetland type environment. You have 4 billion hectares of forest. The vast majority of that will be on these free draining soils where you're not going to get much methane being produced. You get a small amount in sort of these little microsites. So we were actually looking for some emission from these little microsites in the soil, from these little anaerobic pockets that can exist even in a free draining soil. And we were measuring methane exchange on the tree stems surfaces. So near the base of the tree, yes, we did often find a little bit of emission, but much, much smaller than you'd find in a wetland environment. But then as we moved up the tree, that declined. So we got to about 1 meter or so. And in places of the Amazon, for example, even lower than that, we didn't see any, next to no methane being emitted, and it was all being taken up. So the higher up the tree we went, we found more and more methane being taken up from the atmosphere. So now we're talking about a different.
So does that mean that the concentration you were measuring, like higher up the tree, was lower than the atmospheric concentration?
Exactly that. So to measure an exchange on a tree, we essentially had to create an enclosure on the tree surface, a chamber, if you will, and that was linked to an analyzer. So once you've contained that, any process that's going on at the bark surface will manifest itself in a concentration change within that chamber. So if you're seeing an emission, you'll see an increase in concentration, and if you see an uptake, you're basically seeing a decline in the concentration within that volume. So that was the surprise to us, and we had to we pulled together results from a whole range of sites. So that's from like a number of trees, and a large number of trees in the Amazon, and we also from Panama, and then also in the UK and in Scandinavia as well. And we brought all that together, and we had to come up with an entirely new understanding or a new metric of how much bark surface area there is in the world. So in order to scale up, we needed to get this new understanding. Now, Leaves, we have a pretty good idea of, and there's these things called like a leaf area index, which you can use in ecosystem science to scale up. Very different for trees, which have a very complex architecture. You have the stem, and then you have the branch and these little twigs. But I worked with colleagues working out of Oxford at the time, led by Yadvinder Mali, to basically those colleagues were taking this system called terrestrial laser scanning out into forests, and they did this across around 20 forests. They create these point clouds around these trees, and then they were able to work out just how much surface area there was in these trees down to the finest twig. And that allowed us then to upscale our results, and that's where we came up with this, wow, this is an entirely new sink term. So if you go back to, if you remember the global methane budget that you showed, and yes, on the sink side, the biggest sink term is methane being taken up in the atmosphere, being consumed and destroyed by hydroxyl. Then you have this other small sink, which is the soil sink. We've now found that these trees are actually taking up about as much, if not a bit more, than the soil is taking up. So this is kind of important. I mean, the soil sink was first identified in like 1983. And, you know, we're not changing our soil much in terms of area. We're certainly not changing it in terms of area. Yes, we're changing it in terms of deposition of various pollutants, which may have an effect, various nutrient deposition, different farming practices and land use practices, they can have an effect. But you're not fundamentally changing the area. Whereas with trees, the opposite is the case. You're changing the area of surface contact between the bark and the atmosphere simply through deforestation or afforestation. So this presents us with a lever.
But that's really amazing. That indeed, that of course, it's if you look at a forest, you see that there's much more surface area of biomass than if you just look at a bare mountain, right? It's and then you say that that there was almost no research or no data on how much like surface a tree surface a forest has just for the leaves. And I think that's it's mind blowing to learn that, and it makes, in a way, it makes a lot of sense that, of course, there's a lot of happening on these, also on the body of the tree in a way. But does that also depend on the species of the tree? Because I think I can imagine a barch tree or what are all these English names? The pine trees or oak trees. They all have very different surface areas.
So there's a number of things we're at the very outset here of understanding what's going on this huge surface. You know, the same surface. Actually, when we added it all up, we have exactly and if you were to unwrap the trees of their bark and lay it out flat, it would be almost the same as the global land surface area. So, you know, given that, I think we should know a little bit more about it.
Of all trees?
All trees, if we were to unwrap them, exactly that. So, you know, that's a huge surface area that's in contact with the atmosphere, that's having this important biogeochemical interaction. Wow. Yet we know very little about the microbes that are living there. I mean, we're starting to make inroads now, but you're absolutely right. The tree species that we don't know why different tree species take up different amounts, but I'll give you an example. You look at the uptake that we found in the tropics. I will call it a unitless, sort of dimensionless number. So say we found 50 units of methane being taken up on as an average across these trees in the Amazon, right? We also found some trees taking up 300 units. Now we use the average value, but finding out what's happening to that tree that's taking up 300 units would be incredibly useful. Not necessarily for we wouldn't want to be modifying natural forests, of course not, but it could help us to perhaps understand for plantation forestry, for commercial forestry, you know, where, you know, there's wood in our houses, right? This is something that we have. And yes, we have to be careful to not impact on natural ecosystems, which unfortunately is the case a lot of the time. But certainly for those trees, while they're standing, they have surface area that's in contact with the atmosphere. Now, if we can unlock the effect of, that 300 unit uptake tree and transfer that, however, and it might be something very simple to do as well. It may not be super, gene engineering type technology. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just selection, maybe just understanding.
But is that two of the same species of trees?
So no, this was in the Amazon. We didn't, for a lot of these, we didn't even know the species because it's a hyperdiverse forest. A lot of the tree bark looks the same. A lot of the leaves are high up. It's very tricky to understand what's going on there. Just in terms of numbers, we know that there's that diversity of uptake. So, not only can we first start to improve uptake by just planting more trees, and this is a lever that we can pull in the global methane budget that should have a very low bar to public acceptance, because you get the carbon benefits, you get the biodiversity benefits, you get a whole range of additional benefits.
Reduction in ozone.
All these things. And, and so that's just with ordinary trees, just growing ordinary trees. But also if you're able to unlock the microbes that are living there, because essentially those trees are habitats for the microbes that are doing the heavy lifting that we're after. If we can unlock their capacity, find out what's limiting them, then that's something that's extraordinarily useful, because in that context, much like with young tree seedlings that are put in where a little bit of fertilizer is added, it could be something that's very simple to do, to add and to change that phytomicrobial community to affect an even better uptake.
So that's phyto-based. So I think that's that's based that uses sunlight or uses light to reduce the amount of methane.
No, not necessarily. So this is actually a process that's independent of photosynthesis.
Oh, I thought because you said phyto,
yeah.
I really
okay. So no, these are. I'm talking about the phytomicrobiome. So it's kind of like the microbes that are inhabiting the tree. Yeah, and it might be a case where you could transplant the phytomicrobiome of a very good tree and put it into a tree that isn't functioning so well, but we know it has desirable traits in terms of its wood production, its fiber production, etc. So you can get the productive forest or the productive plantation, but then you also get the additional benefit of ramping up its methane uptake power. And these are
it's like probiotica for trees. Is that, could you call it like probiotica for trees?
Yes, a probiotic could work. An actual transplant, it sounds a bit distasteful, but people have these colon transplants, so they have the a fecal transplant to effect a beneficial outcome. It's very similar to that in concept. So we're investigating that. We've had some funding through from Spark Climate Solutions, operating out of the US, who are looking to seed new technologies and new ideas around how to draw down methane from the atmosphere. And we're hoping that this is a promising angle. We need far more data, though, in these forests. That was the first study that we published in Nature back in 2024. So, we need to do far more. And we're going to be doing that in Africa, to be fair. We're going to be going to Ghana and understanding new limitations, hydrological limitations on this uptake capacity as well.
Okay, very insane. Last question is, and do you think this also is the case? This also happens in more temperate forests in our
Yes,
forests?
it does. I don't want to give the impression that it's only the tropical forests. The tropical forests are where we found the biggest effect, and that's quite natural because it's warmer. The microbes are operating faster, but we do find it in temperate forests as well. So if you want to consider it as in terms of an improvement over the climate good that a tree provides, in the tropics about 12%. In temperate ecosystems and temperate forests, we think it's around 8% additional climate good for that tree. Yeah.
And I can imagine it also depends. For example, in the Netherlands, of course, we have a lot of cattle, very highly densely populated area with a lot of cattle. And then the methane concentration is also higher. So there the effect might be
Absolutely.
also a bit increased. But then we have to. It will be interesting to see that. Maybe there's some studies that can happen here as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think that was really interesting. Thank you very much for your very clear presentation. I think there's. Do you have anything else to add? Or
We can go to some
we
questions. That's all good.
Great. Thank you very much again. Hi, Dan.
Hi, and hi, Vincent. Great to have you on Climate Chat. Really interesting. Wait, let's let me see. How do we do this? There we go. Get you to be the bigger one here. We had a lot of activity and a lot of questions. So really what I'm hearing is that the sulfur pollution was suppressing methane formation in wetlands, which is a huge source of methane, and having a much bigger effect than I guess anyone's realized. So a bunch of questions related to that. And then, of course, with trees playing a big role as well. So a lot of this, of course, when people think of methane, they think of the Arctic. They think of permafrost melt. And so I guess one question is, do you see a role for sulfur pollution to play, maybe suppressing methane formation in the Arctic? Have you looked at the Arctic at all in your research?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, in the past, there have been analogs of atmospheric pollutant deposition through volcanic eruptions, for example. So, and I actually wrote a paper on this. The Laki eruption of 1783 could be considered an analog of atmospheric pollution that existed in the 80s across Northeast America and into Central and Northern Europe. And there was around 120 million tons of SO2 was emitted over the space of about a year or so. And that was deposited over high latitude environments. But, you know, I have to say the results aren't good. You know, there were local effects. I think something like a third of the population of Iceland was lost as a consequence of this through polluted water. We know from parish records in France, for example, that there was a big uptick in mortality during that period after the eruption.
Was it only because of sulfur or also?
There'd be other things. So there was a lot of fluoride that entered in the water as well. So yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's important to distinguish the different contributors to that pollution event. But we did look at the sulfur effect on that, and we found there was actually we modeled it using the similar approach to what I reported back in the PNAS paper in 2004, and we also coupled that modeling with some investigations into the ice core of the ice core record at that time, and we do find this sort of, it's a period where there was a general increase in methane as we were coming out of the Little Ice Age around that in the sort of 1600s, early 1700s, and around that time, 1783, 84, we do see this stalling of methane coming from these high latitude wetlands. Now, you know, so we're pretty confident that it's a real effect. We have an ancient analog of that event. But you ask a different question, which is, you know, could we modify this pristine environment that maybe is functionally, as some people like to put it, functionally operating in response to anthropogenic drivers, which would be climate warming, and we know that the very high latitudes are receiving more than their fair share of warming. And you know, I go back to this kind of approach of, well, and I don't know how realistic it is. Hey, it's better to abate the emissions, right? It's better to abate the anthropogenic CO2, methane, etc., and trying to head off that anthropogenic driver than to deliberately try and modify an ecosystem process. Because,
but what would that look like? It's of course, just because I always get the same question when I talk about the sulfur emission from shipping. People say, "Oh, so we should do it on purpose." In a way, that's the same question here. So, should we emit or should we add sulfur on purpose? Maybe either to the permafrost or to the rice paddies or to regions which will otherwise emit too much methane.
that exact thing has happened in rice paddies. People have been looking at how to abate methane emissions from rice paddies, and sulfate has been looked at as a way of doing that, and it does work. So that's kind of a useful approach. I would argue that you could do this, but the practicalities of it, if you remember, and it's also this issue of a possibility, and I know you're familiar with this term, Leon, of a termination shock. Is that you're locked in. If you're going to do this, just from a practical point of view, you have to keep doing it. And logistically, you're wanting deposition in a certain location that's quite tightly defined but extensive. So you're going to have to, it's an engineering feat, and you're going to have to keep doing it. Practically, it's not going to happen.
But it's a baseline in a way. In many regions, that is, at the moment, it's the baseline. So when you talk about the termination shock, which you terminate the emissions of sulfur, you get a warming shock. And I think you called it in the article you wrote, you called the rebound. And that's in a way, so that if you stop sulfur emissions, which we are of course doing by clean air regulations and reducing the sulfur emissions, then we get more warming, which also, of course, cause more rainfall and will cause more warming and cause more productivity of these microbes. But then also it will reduce the amount of sulfur available for the microbes, which the microbes that bear your name really like, right? So and that's the rebound. So how big is this rebound? Can you give an estimate of like what will happen when countries start to reduce the sulfur emissions by, for example, India by about 50%?
Those data are and those estimates are in the Science Advances paper. So we're in the order of teragrams. I think on the 2-degree scenario, it's something like just over 32 teragrams or 32 million tons additional methane coming out. But like you say, it's a rebound. And I think it's useful to look at wetlands in a slightly different way to how they've been considered within the Earth system in terms of feedbacks. So you're quite right that you create more methane, and that creates more warming, and that feeds back, etc. But that additional methane actually doesn't contribute hugely to that warming. Okay. The way I like to look at wetlands is that I consider them more as amplifiers of whatever signal you put into the Earth system. Okay, so if you were to if you were to add more CO2 into the atmosphere, for example, and you were to create warming and also CO2 enrichment as a fertilizer, for example, then you're going to amplify that effect through more methane. Conversely, because it's such a responsive system, conversely, if you turn down that additional, I understand the feedback element, but actually the additional methane isn't contributing hugely to to the feedback. If you were to slow down that CO2 output and reduce it significantly, reduce other anthropogenic greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, the dial on that amplifier would then turn down, and you will get less methane being produced from the wetland. And I think that's a more useful construct to consider it in, because it's responsive to whatever signal you give it. And I'd rather focus on the signal rather than on the output from that system to push that kind of analogy a bit far. But I hope that makes sense. But you're right. I mean,
it sounds consistent.
And
Jim Hansen. Jim Hansen and Leon. Go ahead.
Sorry, Dan, we're talking over each other. In principle, yes. The idea is, and we've seen it in the past, that you could add more sulfur. But you're locking yourself into a real problem. The vast majority of the methane isn't coming from the high northern latitudes. Vast majority is coming from things like the Amazon floodplain, for example, and other places like the Congo, etc. Now, those operate very differently to the high latitude peatlands. And the peatlands, you have sulfur being deposited, and you get a certain element of cycling. The fact that you have a peatland is because the water isn't going anywhere. in the floodplain of the Amazon, it's a wholly different situation. You have very high water levels, huge volumes of water, and it moves. So anything you add, it's gone within a few months. So you're pushing against a system that really doesn't want to receive this stuff, and is in all likelihood, in terms of the physical practicality of deploying this as a technology to arrest emissions.
Yes. How do you get millions of tons of sulfur in the Amazon? Indeed, it's a quite a crazy question to ask.
It's a good provocation, though, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it gets you thinking through the system and how you can actually do that. But yeah, ultimately, it doesn't take a huge amount of thought to realize it's not going to happen.
But it sounds consistent.
Yeah. But in India, I think that's where India is, of course, quite in India and the other countries where they produce a lot of rice. I think that's and especially if it can increase the yields of these rice fields. That I think that then you get into very different discussions instead of dumping it in the middle of the
absolutely. And you're right. Sulfur is actually a micronutrient. I mean, in the UK, a lot of the arable fields, they're having to add sulfur because they're now impoverished, because they don't have that load that used to be coming in through from industrial activity. So you're absolutely right. That these are very complex issues that are fascinating and interesting to talk around, but getting engineers to think through, they look at this, it's just not practical. Yeah. But you're right, these anthropogenic wetlands like the rice paddies are certainly an area where you could work on arresting emissions.
Yeah, and of course improves. I think that's a really crucial aspect indeed. If you increase the nutrients available for the plants and also for the people that eventually eat the food, that's it could be a win opportunity. And I think that's really, because of course we started this conversation. The title was a bit scary, but I think in the end there's also by doing this research you can learn a lot about how this planet functions, as you explained, like how much tree bark surface there is, and that can help us, and I think that's really crucial to understand how we can increase that and how we can find win-win opportunities with the information that's available. Thank you very much for bringing these crucial answers to the science.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, we have some more questions
from
the comments.
I'm not signing off just yet.
If you have time.
Okay.
Sorry, if you have time.
I'll take a couple more questions, absolutely.
Okay, so this one, I guess, sort of a big one, is that there was a pause in atmospheric methane between around 2000 2010. It was going up and then it flattened out, then it started going up again. Some people said that was, fracking got increased then, and probably was part of that. We had Robert Howarth on Climate Chat a long time ago where we discussed that. But listening to you, I'm saying, well, wait a second, maybe suppression of sulfur pollution has played a role in that. What are your thoughts on that? On that pause and then the more rapid increase?
So, I mean, this is a really interesting figure, actually. So you have, we can take it all the way back because you can see the trajectory is a decline from the 90s down. And, there are sort of geopolitical shifts involved in that. The decline is principally around the 90s. The decline of the Soviet Union and sort of investment coming into the oil fields and into fossil fuel production, tightened up the pipes, the leaky pipes, essentially. So, you see a reduction there. It's interesting, actually, because we were talking volcanoes a second ago, and you can see just after 1990, there's this sort of spike, this increase in methane, followed by a dramatic drop. That's actually that's the effect of the Pinatubo eruption that happened in 91. So with that eruption, you had a lot of gunk thrown up into the atmosphere, and that sort of had a couple of effects. Once it limited UV, which is instrumental in producing hydroxyl and for cleaning up the atmosphere, but also you had so many other things that went up into the stratosphere and into the troposphere that the OH sink was actually otherwise occupied. So it extended the lifetime of methane temporarily, and then you get the cooling effect the following year. So I won't dwell much further on that, but then you do get this reduction, and you get this kind of stabilizing period. And there are still a lot of questions about that. And we do really need to get a handle on what's going on with the sink in the atmosphere to answer these questions. But yes, the increase that's been happening has been puzzling. It does seem like, particularly in the big pulses that you see in around 2020, 2021, it does seem like there's a lot more methane being produced. And we do know that there are increasing wetland emissions from Africa in particular. So in places like the Sud, there's extensive seasonal wetlands in the grasslands that become wet all of a sudden. These can produce a heck of a lot of methane, and we don't fully understand those systems just yet. There aren't that many measurements, so that's one of the big ideas, is that actually you're getting more wetland methane emissions from some of these locations in the tropics, and that's.
But part of that could be what you're talking about. So part of it could be fracking, part of it could be obviously higher temperatures creating obviously more methane, but part of it could be reduction in the sulfur that was suppressing the methane. And so it's not like the only thing, but it could be additive to that.
Sure. And, we haven't presented the spatial distribution on the sulfur deposition in the last study. But yes, that could be an effect. The fact is the African wetlands that we think are contributing a lot more wouldn't have been experiencing a huge amount of S deposition in the first place. So it tends to be like the industrial, China, Southeast Asia, etc. So yes, you're right, and there will be an increase. We're showing that it's possible that there's a contribution there. Also, if you look back at what we were talking about briefly, towards the end of the podcast, the fact that trees are a sink term. Now, it could be that increased deforestation could be reducing that sink as well. So that's actually one of the projects that I've got funded currently by UKRI, and why we're going to Ghana is to understand that sink in a greater detail, so we can model that deforestation and see if that would have contributed at all. So there are likely to be a number of drivers, but certainly within the natural emissions and uptake, there could be a number of different things at play, and liberation of sulfate rather could be a factor, definitely.
No, you're making the collapse of the Amazon even more scary than it already is, and it's already scary. So,
right.
Wow. And then just a couple more. Then, and you kind of got into this, but you talked about OH radical depletion, and you were talking about your microbes, the ones that are sulfur stimulated, are producing less hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very powerful indirect greenhouse gas because it destroys those OH radicals, which otherwise would destroy methane. Does your work look into that secondary effect at all?
Less
or
so.
Maybe it's just part of it altogether. Maybe.
I think that effect on the hydrogen within the wetland, within the peatland, is very much an internal cycling. So the sulfate reducers that without sulfate are producing an excess of hydrogen that would be deleterious to their own health. They have a partnership with the methanogens who would not be mopping it up. So once once their function changes to competing with the methanogens, they're no longer providing that hydrogen. So it's you've got a complex situation there. I won't say it's fully understood either.
Okay.
No,
you talked about it's kind of related to the other things, but we talk a lot about solar radiation management on Climate Chat as a way to quickly address the temperature issue, which nothing else is going to address it quickly. That very often, when one of the main ways of doing that is to put sulfur in the stratosphere, which would then fall out. Have you actually looked at that at all? Do you think it would have an impact on the work that you're doing?
It's an interesting thing that I've considered. I haven't done the calculations on that, but I suspect it would be far too small and far too diffuse to have any material effect in terms of an additional cooling effect through its impact on global wetlands. Yes, you would, if you were to go through that approach and put more sulfur into the atmosphere for solar radiation management, it's going to rain out eventually, and you will enrich the wetlands. But I suspect, because the amounts are quite small, aren't they? That you actually
1/20th of what we currently do. Yeah.
There you go. So
something like that. Yeah.
I mean, I don't, and also I don't know where it would be deposited.
I think it'd be more uniform, actually.
It probably
and
would be
2/3 across the oceans, because that's what 2/3 of the surface area is. So
yeah.
And then I guess final question: you talked about trees and absorbing methane. Does the same hold true for plants in general? Because that might be useful. Someone mentioned putting, plants around where your cows are to try to absorb things.
I think height is important here, because what you have is a battle between production, albeit small microbial pockets of production in free draining soils, and the uptake processes. And the nearer you are to the surface of the soil, the nearer you are to those little micro sites that might be producing the methane. So the smaller trees, or the smaller shrubs, or herbaceous plants, they're likely to not really be harboring methanotrophs that are taking up from the atmosphere. They're more likely, if anything, if there is a source of methane, to be harboring methanotrophs that are specialized at slightly higher concentrations of methane. We've looked at, in our experiments and our studies looking at soil emissions, quite often the chambers enclose whatever plant is in there, and you tend to see the uptake, and it's always tends to be attributed to the soil. Now, the other thing with methanotrophs is they're very slow growing. So they need surfaces that are kind of old or can linger for a while. And you don't find that necessarily with herbaceous plants, because they can be annuals, or they shed their leaves quite quickly. It's why we struggle to find an uptake. Potentially, it's a reason why we struggle to find much of an uptake on leaves, because they need to develop a microbial community, which takes time, and with slow growing methanotrophs. So it could be a function of the fact that you have these long-lived surfaces that allows that microbial community to develop.
Very good. Very interesting. Very fascinating discussion.
I read that methanotrophs are like bacteria, a certain type of bacteria that converts methane into methanol. Is that true?
So they can convert it into CO2, and there's a real diversity of methanotrophs and methylotrophs that do a range of things. I mean, there are a number of ideas about what's going on there, and actually, to be brutally honest, we know so little about the microbes on these in these trees. There's a whole community within the tree itself, on the bark as well, all having an influence that we know little about. So I know there are some studies likely to come downstream that are going to start giving us insights. But when you couple that diversity with the tree diversity, species diversity, location diversity, there's a huge world there to uncover. And we're only just at the outset.
Wow. Fascinating research. By the way, we cover so many things on Climate Chat. It's very rare that we cover something that just is not talked about before in the climate community. This is like a new aspect. It sounds like a quite important one. So thanks for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I've learned a lot. I've looked at trees in many ways, and this is a new way of looking at trees again.
It's always good to look at trees. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for everyone listening. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so this kind of information can reach more people. What did you say, Lynn?
And this climate chat will be available after this. You can share it with your friends and family, and with the scientific community, which would like to hear about this. I think.
Yeah, using the same link that you're watching live. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.